Hello?
Hello!
Oh, hi, how are you?
I've got this thing. I was wondering if maybe you can help me.
Yeah, sure, what is it?
Well, I have this audition on Sunday, and I was wondering if maybe you could play the piano for me.
Yeah, no problem. What's the material?
It's like Incy Wincy Spider, I think it's easy. But do you want me to send you the music?
No, that's probably fine. I'll just sight read it on the day.
Oh, amazing! Thanks so much! Cool, well, I'll see you Sunday. Bye-bye!
Bye, Therese. Incy Wincy Spider.
Right, so this is a little low for me. You think you can just put it up to G flat or something?
When we talk about accompaniment in music, we're referring to the part of the music that isn't the main focus, but rather the part that kind of supports the main parts in their performance. Certain instruments are popular for accompaniment, such as pianos, other keyboards, guitars, and different kinds of string instruments like harps and zithers. But technically, any instrument can play an accompaniment part. The person playing the accompanying part is called an accompanist. And some accompanists even specialize in their job as an accompanist through higher education, because good accompanists are expected to not only sight read well, but usually also be able to improvise a bit, and they have to be constantly adaptable to whatever's going on in the other parts of the music. So it's a pretty demanding role to have. The concept of an instrument accompanying a singer is very old, as we can, for example, see illustrations of singers accompanied by string instruments in pottery from ancient Greece. Also, according to Greek myths, the god Apollo, who was the god of music and art, and many other things, would accompany himself on a lyre, a small harp-like instrument, while singing. It's hard to know how accompaniment parts would have sounded like in antiquity due to a lack of sources, but we have a better idea of how they would have sounded from the Middle Ages onwards. Initially, they would have been very simple, mostly consisting of doubling the melody, either exactly or with some variation, or providing a drone for the singers to sing over. However, with the advent of functional harmony during the 17th century, which involved relatively complex harmony changes over the course of a piece, musicians developed a shorthand type of notation that, along with a written-out bass line, would tell the musicians what chords to play. This type of shorthand notation is called basso continuo, or figured bass, and was used up until the 19th century. Figured bass notation looks like this, and what you're having here is essentially a bass clef with a bass line and some numbers written over some of the notes. And the idea here is that the person playing will then improvise an accompaniment based on the intervals that these are from the bass note. What I found very interesting when I started playing in a big band back in university was that we would use charts that look like this. Like with figured bass, you're expected to be able to improvise over these chords. And I found it very fascinating that what people did back in the 1600s is essentially what we do in big band music and even in a lot of pop music still. Figured bass kind of fell out of fashion around the middle of the 18th century, but it was used kind of up until sort of the early 1800s, because composers decided to instead write out all the accompaniment parts and have the players play them exactly as written. When you have accompaniment that's written out exactly as it's supposed to be played, it's called obbligato accompaniment. And obbligato means obligatory. That's kind of the implication. You're playing it exactly as it's written. If you have an accompaniment part that's supposed to be improvised, that's called an ad lib accompaniment part, with ad lib meaning at liberty, or free. Gradually, the modern chord symbol system was developed and used for pop music. I'm not sure exactly when this happened, but we do find chord symbols in the piano and guitar parts of the big band music from the 20s onwards, and it has been in common use in Western pop music ever since. Pop musicians usually improvise their accompaniment based on the chord progression of the music they're performing, though some obbligato elements may still exist in the accompaniment, such as countermelodies or specific rhythms. If you purchase pop sheet music from a reputable vendor these days, it will usually have both a written out obbligato accompaniment part and chord symbols, so the accompanist can choose whether to follow the notation strictly, or improvise, or both. When you're writing accompaniment parts for choirs, the practice will vary greatly depending on the style of the music and the type of choir you're writing for. In the classical sphere, obbligato accompaniment is kind of the standard practice, whereas with pop choirs you do find a mix of improvised accompaniment and obbligato accompaniment. So it's really important that you know what type of choir you're writing for, so you can determine what type of accompaniment part you should give the accompanist. Of course, it helps a lot if you're already good at the piano, if you're writing out a piano part, but not necessarily everyone arranging for choir is going to be good at the piano. So let's look at some general tips I can give you for writing out an accompaniment part for your choir music. 1. Keep it simple. Since an accompanying part is generally not the main focus, there's no point in making it overly complex, unless you have something very specific in mind, and your accompanist can do it justice. There's nothing wrong with giving your accompanist a chord chart with the style and tempo on it if this is all the music requires, and you can write in any essential lines you want without providing a fully notated part. Just as an example, let's have a look at a chart that I did last year of my university. This is a song by Chick Corea called Crystal Silence, and you can see that I use a mix of obbligato and ad-lib accompaniment here. It starts out with an obbligato line, and then later on I write in comp freely, and I use so-called rhythm slashes with just the chord notation on top. And that, knowing that I was writing for a jazz pianist, I knew that they would be able to interpret those chord symbols. And you'll see that at certain points I write in important lines that I want to use. Most of the time I'm just using one clef. If there are any points where I feel like I need to have something exactly played the way I want it, then I will write in a normal obbligato kind of accompaniment part. I do keep the chords in most of the time so that the pianist can then fill in chords and do whatever they think is appropriate. I should add that if you're writing jazz music, you don't have to write in every extension you want the piano player or guitarist to use, as they will usually be able to put in extensions on their own. This is something you kind of get used to when you're playing jazz music. You can if you want to, but it's not necessary. 2. The bass part generally belongs in the left-hand piano part, not the bass choral part. This may sound counterintuitive, as the bass choral part is literally called the bass part. But whereas most people singing the bass part in a choir will only be able to project down to a low G, maybe slightly below, the piano can play down to this super low A with a full range of dynamics. The piano also has a naturally percussive quality, so it will also provide a strong rhythmic quality at the same time as playing the notes clearly. This frees up your bass singers to do the melody, harmonies, or other fun things, and avoids a situation where they sing the bass line from start to finish. If you're looking for a good cutoff point when it comes to the bass part on the piano, a good place to cut off is the low E, as this is the bottom note for most double basses, at least the ones that don't have a C extension. You can go lower than this, but it does end up sounding quite dark. Also, if you want a little bit of extra if you want some extra weight when you've got loud sections in the song, you can also have the bass in octaves. This might end up looking a bit strange in your notation because there'll be quite a lot of ledger lines towards the bottom note. But generally you wouldn't have any other intervals than octaves when it's really low on the piano. So any piano player will then look at the top note and just assume that it's going to be octaves. So this is fine. 3. The right hand should generally be playing chords, and these usually sound richest if put in this range, quickly becoming muddy if put much lower, and shrill if put much higher. If possible, keep them to 3 notes most of the time, and only use 4 if absolutely necessary. While we do have 5 fingers on each hand, the stretching required to play more than 4 notes at once in one hand makes it impractical in most cases. and reading lines consisting of 4-note chords is difficult and usually unnecessary. You can also put chord symbols in the right hand if your accompanist reads these, if you want a more improvised quality in your accompaniment. If you're not a piano player, be very careful with writing difficult piano parts, as you may not quite know what's the difference between kind of the difficult piano parts that will be effective and the ones that will kind of be unnecessarily so. If you're in doubt, keep it simple, and you can write in chord symbols and notation so that the expert at the piano can decide what's appropriate for the situation. 4. There's no need to put in pedaling instructions, as any capable pianist will use the pedal automatically. However, if you want a section of the song to not use the pedal, this should be indicated, as standard practice is to play with the pedal. And just in case you're interested in knowing what the pedals do, grand pianos tend to have 3 pedals. The right one, which is the most common one, is called the sustain pedal, and this is what most pianists will play with all the time, and it just makes all the notes last a bit longer until they release the pedal. This one, the left one, is called the soft pedal, or the una corda pedal, meaning 1 chord, as most pianos generally play 3 strings at once. This one shifts the hammers to the side, so they only play 1. This one makes the sound softer. And if you have an upright, it might only have these 2 pedals. But a lot of grand pianos also have the middle pedal, and the middle pedal is called the sostenuto pedal. And this is like a selective sustain pedal, so it only sustains the notes that you have pressed while you press this pedal, and then anything you press afterwards will not be sustained. And this is more of a specialist pedal. Generally, when you're indicating pedaling, it'll be for this pedal, and possibly that one if you just write una corda. Finally, there's no need to put accompanying parts in the vocal parts if you're using an accompanist, as the accompanist is already doing that job. Instead, focus on spreading out the melody, giving the other parts harmonies and counter melodies, and maybe some long oohs and ahs, since the piano usually can't sustain the notes for as long as the voices can. Remember, just like you should be arranging for the choir you have rather than the choir you want to have, you should be arranging for the accompanist you have, and give them whatever they need to help the singers do a good job. The accompaniment is not going to be the main focus, so it's perfectly fine to give the accompanist an easy part. Anyway, that's it for today's episode. Leave me a comment if you have any questions, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with your friends if you think they'll find it useful. And I'll see you in the next episode of Choir with Knut.